Hello and welcome. I'm Brian Balke, the very proud superintendent of schools serving the communities of Goffstown and New Boston. I'd like to thank you for watching this informational video about the warrant articles that Goffstown voters will see on the polls on the second Tuesday in March. So specifically this year, Article 1 will be the election of officers. Article 2 will be the budget. Article 3 will be our support staff contract. Article 4 will be a deposit into the Capital Reserve Fund, and Article 5 will be the closing of a Capital Reserve Fund. So in this video, we will go through each of those respective warrant articles, except for Article 1. We won't get into the election of officers, but 2 through 5 will provide an overview. Before we begin, though, I'd like to just emphasize this video is intended to inform people, to educate people. This is not intended to influence or sway. We want people to be informed and to know what they're going to see when they go into the polls the second Tuesday of March. So with that, Mr. Gross, I'll hand it off to you.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Scott Gross. I'm the Business Administrator for SAU19, serving the Goffstown School District. And today, I'm joined by Kate McGrath, the HR Director for the district, as well as Jared Talbot, who is a school board representative. And today, we're going to be talking about the warrant articles that you're going to see when you vote on March 14th, 2023 for school district elections. I first off want to say that our comments today are not intended to persuade anyone to vote a certain way. This is strictly informational. And what you're going to see at the polls are 4 or 5 warrant articles. The first one is the election of officers. And these have to deal with, there are 3 school board members that are up for election, and you'll be voting on that. The second article deals with the district's operating budget. And the third article, which is Article 3, GESS support staff contract. And Kate's going to cover that. Article 4 is a capital reserve fund deposit from unassigned fund balance, and Mr. Talbot will be discussing that warrant article. And lastly, Article 5 is the closing of the Bartlett Capital Reserve Fund. So we're going to get started and on the operating budget. And I'm going to turn it over to Jared, who's going to go over the budget priorities this year.
Thank you, Scott. So I want to acknowledge the budgetary inflation pressures that we have within the school systems while balancing the responsibilities of having a somewhat lean budget this year, knowing that we have several things within the hopper coming through the warrant articles. We're going to continue to use federal grants where appropriate to support our student needs and invest within our infrastructure within the school system. We're going to reallocate some of our resources amongst the schools to remain staffing neutral for this budget. For our fiscal year 24, the district's focus will remain on educational remediation, enrichment, and learning, mental health, and social emotional learning as well. We're going to have an emphasis on mathematics-based criteria because our testing data coming out of COVID was a little bit under where it should be. So we're going to be emphasizing that this year.
Yeah, and a lot of this, Jared, I think focuses on, we're coming out of COVID and we knew that there was a lot of learning loss that came of that, mathematics being really the biggest issue. The challenge for us is that as a district is trying to move these resources around. So what we're seeing at the elementary school level is greater population there. At the high school level, at the middle school level, it's a little bit flatter. So we're moving a lot of resources from, say, high school open positions to elementary, or in some cases, special education. So this next slide that you're seeing is really an overview of the budget. And basically, the budget is comprised of 3 funds. It's the general fund, which is pretty much the operating budget for the school district, as well as the food service fund. And this is a self-sustaining fund, meaning that the fees that are paid, the lunch prices and the breakfast costs are offset those expenses. And then lastly is a special revenue or a grants fund. And over the last couple of years, the district has received quite a bit of grant money from the federal government, and this is where those funds are coming from. So usually we have about $1 million coming in from grants, but due to COVID and ESSER type funds, it's going to be a little over $2.5 million. Now next year, it's going to dip back down to that $1 million. So in total, you'll see that our total proposed budget is $52,512,180. I also should talk about, you'll see on the third column, I should say, is the default budget. And the default budget is basically, should the proposed budget fail, this is kind of like the budget that the district has to use. It is essentially the current year's budget. And then if there are any contractually obligated costs that were approved by the voters. In this case, we have a teacher's contract last year that is automatically rolled into the default. And then there's some other ones like special education that would stay in. But other than that, that budget, the proposed budget is a little over $294,000 more than the default. So Jared, I kind of want to turn this one over to you. We're going to talk about enrollments, but so basically from FY22 to FY23, as you can see, we're going from 2,764 students up to about 2,906. And really the discussion that we wanted to have was, right, you asked me before, like, how do we get that? And I would say that we know from year over year, like we know from the first grade is going into the second grade, and we know historically that we see usually 2, 3, 4, 5 kids more that do enter the system mid-year. And then the biggest wild card, Jared, is kindergarten, and we just don't know because we have students that are not, they are enrolled in perhaps private preschool programs, et cetera. So that's the biggest wild card that we see. And I think, as you can, from this previous slide, 188 students right now at Glen Lake, we're projecting 220. And I think you mentioned before, was it role models that?
Yeah, so we have two distinct types of students that we have at our early education center at Glen Lake, as I like to call it. This is for really 3-year-olds all the way up to kindergarten. And those preschoolers have something called role models. So the two types of students that we have are role model students, which are students that parents pay tuition for those individuals to attend the school. And that would be in 3rd and 4-year-olds. And those are really to support our students that have IEPs at the age of 3 and 4 in those areas. So what happens is we want to have role models mixed in with our special education IEP students that really want to transfer or have that social emotional learning component at Glen Lake. And then within kindergarten, we are contractually obligated by the state to have half-day kindergarten. We currently have 2 sessions in the morning and the afternoon. But as Mr. Gross said, we know that doesn't support a lot of our parents here at Goffstown. So there are some parents that do place their students or their children into private kindergarten. And once those students go to 1st grade, they go to Bartlett or Maple. So what we're seeing right now is really a spike in our early childhood students within the school districts in kindergarten, in preschool, as well as the elementary school level, while our middle school and high school are remaining somewhat static and flat. But this is going to be an area of concern that we have at the school board as we move forward into following years.
And the one last thing on enrollments is you're hearing a lot when you read the newspaper or even in social media how enrollments are declining in many, many districts. And that is accurate, but Goffstown is not one of them. So, and as a matter of fact, as you can see, Goffstown's been fairly level through COVID, and we are expecting that we're going to see some increases in the coming years. So the next slide we want to talk about is really the cost per pupil information. And this is a very, very interesting data set that the state of New Hampshire compiles. And what they do is they take all the financial data from every school district across the state, and they try to benchmark it against the state average so that schools can determine how they're doing in terms of how they spend their money per pupil. So in FY22, for an example, the Goffstown Elementary School cost per pupil was $16,477, which was the 11th lowest out of 155 school districts. So again, we are getting good bang for our buck. Middle school, the same trend continues, where in FY22, the average cost per middle school student was $14,787, the 4th lowest out of 62 school districts who have middle schools. And again, a little over $3,700 less per pupil than the state average. And lastly, Goffstown High School, their cost per pupil in FY22 was $16,765, the 10th lowest out of 73 districts with high school over $2,100 lower than the state average. And interestingly, if it were not for population decreases at Goffstown High School, that number is also typically fourth or fifth lowest. So, overall, Goffstown is a community which year over year has historically spent less per pupil. I think we're very judicious in how we spend our money in Goffstown, and it's, Jared and Kate, it's reflected in the data sets. So Jared, I'm going to turn it over to you in terms of, you worked on this budget. You attended many budget committee meetings and did a great job, by the way. So if you could just talk to us a little bit about what accounted for some of these budget increases.
Sure, thank you, Scott. So yes, I definitely went through at the school board and also the budget committee with all the line-by-line reviews that we do, as well as the totality of our budget reviews. But as we said before, what accounts for our budget increases? First and foremost, there are no new positions. So there's no money from our operating budget going to net new positions that we're using to increase our staff. We have repurposed several of those existing positions into other staffing needs that we have, as Scott mentioned, coming from the high school and going to the elementary school where appropriate. We're also seeing some special needs increases for out-of-district placement. There is a 5% increase that has been approved by the New Hampshire Education Department. I can't get used to saying NED these days. It used to be the New Hampshire DOE, I believe. Mm-hmm. So new acronym that we always have to remember. But this also, there's an increase in transportation costs, as we know, because of those inflationary prices that we have, as well as some of our vendor contracted services. As Scott mentioned, last year we had the voters approve our teachers' four-year budget. So this is a salary obligation that is not only baked into our proposed budget, but is part of our default budget that really accounts for a majority of the increased costs from this current fiscal year. Our health insurance costs have also gone up by 11.5%. We are not unique at this at the school system. This is also at the town. This is throughout the state where the health insurance costs have increased, and we have to, of course, make sure that we pay the staff what they deserve.
And interestingly, I'm just trying to kind of jump in because Kate's here and she deals with health insurance all the time. But Kate, we learned from our health insurance provider that there were a lot of people right during COVID didn't have procedures, and now
so I think a big portion of this increase that occurred with the 11.5% was due to folks who were putting off any kind of elected procedures, maybe not going to the doctor for some of their regular checkups, just because of COVID and what was happening in terms of transmission, and really held off and waited. And that played a big part in what we saw our increase from Health Trust.
And lastly, Jared, we talk about this all the time at the school board meetings, which we pay these bills, and they show up on the manifest. But just like you, the consumers, you're seeing increases in electricity and propane and all these kind of commodities that it takes, and we have to provide power to our buildings. We have to heat the buildings, and unfortunately, the increases in these costs, Jared, they're not part of the default because these are part of what's called new spending, which is greater than the default. And so most of what you're going to see as part of the new spending really is things like oil and propane, electricity. Is driving a lot of that difference between the default and the proposed budget.
Scott, would you say that our utility cost, the usage is the same year for year, but really it's the price that we're paying for the utility, that rate has gone up?
In this particular case, it's been somewhat, it is usage. So we've seen some usage increases at Glen Lake because we put that new addition on, and those are run off of electric. So I think we kind of under budgeted there on that. But in terms of the costs for electricity, that we had a fixed rate on, but propane, no. Propane costs went up. So our usage was the same for propane, but the cost went up. But on the electricity side, it was really more of an increased use of electricity because of Glen Lake. So sorry for that long-winded response, but it was a complicated question.
I would say a follow-up to that, Scott. I'm hearing other districts, those increases in rates that they have, they bake that into the default budget, but we don't do that here at Goffstown. Could you articulate why we don't do that? We put that as part of our proposed budget?
Sure. So the default budget is supposed to be your current year's budget plus any contractual obligations and anything that is legally mandated. All right. And I think that's the difference. There are some school districts or municipalities who point to certain regulations or laws in the education code. One of them is you have to maintain a safe and healthy learning environment for students. And they point to that to say, well, you have to have heat in your building to provide that environment. And therefore, their interpretation of that statute is such. I believe we take a more conservative interpretation of that statute in Goffstown, so and New Boston for that matter. So that's the short answer on that one. So we've wrapped that up, and what I want to share with folks is that if you do have any questions about the budget, I really would prefer that you go to the website. And if you go to the website, you'll see there's a file it's called Budget Files, and on there, all of the budgets are located. You'll see our actuals for the last 3 years. You'll have all the information, not only on the budget article, but what Kate's going to talk to a little bit about our support staff, collective bargaining agreement. All of the information is kind of one-stop shopping. So this is kind of meant to be a highlight. If you want more specifics, go to our website. And also, I would, if you have the time, check out the school deliberative session. Jared did a fantastic job, as well as did Kate, in terms of explaining all of these Warrant articles. And that's really this is more of like the shortened, condensed Reader's Digest version of it. So we're going to turn it over to Kate now, who's going to speak to us about the GESS tentative agreement.
Thank you, Scott. So the bargaining unit proposed contract that is before voters is for our support staff. And our support staff unit is comprised of just over 163 full-time employees. It is comprised of our administrative assistant positions. Our administrative assistants do all the front of the house, back of the house support, whether it's maintaining databases or the folks who greet all of our stakeholders, whether on the phone or in person when they come to visit the schools. It also includes our food service support staff, so our assistants for the kitchen, assistant cooks, and our head cooks. Our facilities staff are included in this bargaining unit, our custodians and our maintenance folks. And the biggest group within this bargaining unit are our paraprofessionals. And paraprofessionals are staff members who are assigned specific students to support with individual education plans.
And Kate, we see like 0.25, and I know we don't divide somebody up in a quarter, but we do have a lot of part-time employees. And I know I was just in our high school kitchen area, and we have a lot of folks who just work, that small time right around the that window of when lunch is kind of prepared and served. So they don't work full-time, but they come in there. So I just, I wanted folks to know that we don't have 163 people. We have more, and it's obviously work for you and others, but we have a lot of people who work just 10, 12, 20 hours.
That's right. Yep, part-time staff. So the proposal that's being put before the voters is asking for 4 years to be approved for the contract. The 4-year agreement encompasses wage increases. There is also a proposal to increase the longevity stipend for staff who have been within the district for 17 or more years. And then we have associated costs with those wage increases. So we have to factor in the increases that occur for New Hampshire retirement system eligible staff, as well as the FICA taxes that the district is responsible for.
Now, Kate, I know as a question that I often get from members of the community is, what is longevity for those members that are on that top step?
Thank you. Yeah, Jared. So longevity is twofold. It is for the staff that have been with the district for 17 or more years. So there are times where we may hire a staff member with 10 years of experience, and they're at the top end of that salary grid. But in this instance, this is people who have given us 17 or more years of service. And the longevity is built because the increases at the top of the grid, which is 16 steps, tend to be smaller than the increases for the rest of the staff as they move through the grid and get raises year over year. So the longevity stipend helps to offset that smaller increase for staff who have spent a lot of years of service for the district.
And for those members that have remained at that longevity step, do they receive this longevity increase year over year, or is this a one-time thing?
So the longevity is paid by the hour, so it's based on however many contracted hours the staff have. And there are incremental increases. So the first group is 17 to 20 years, and then it increases after 20 years. And there are 2 more categories where the longevity will increase based on years of service.
Great, thank you, Kate.
So Kate, before we turn over to the next Warrant article, I know that in our office, I see job postings a lot. I think it's been challenging. Is it fair enough to say that, we're competing with both other school districts, but also in the private sector for a lot of these types of jobs, and I believe that this contract is trying to address that, right?
Absolutely. So we've had some significant hiring issues over the last couple of years in particular. The job market, as many of you know, has been really competitive. We are seeing wage pressures across all industries to increase starting wages for folks. And a lot of these positions allow folks to come into our environment without a lot of training or preparation, before taking on these roles. So they can start as entry-level opportunities, and so does Dunkin' Donuts, so does Target, right. So does Walmart. And so where these positions are so critically important to the running of our buildings, the support of our students, the support of all of our stakeholders, making sure that our kids are fed, making sure that our buildings are ready for teaching and learning, we need to make sure that we can compete with those starting wages. So that was a major focus within this contract, was to bring up those starting wages.
All right, thanks, Kate. So now we're going to pivot to Article number 4, which is the Capital Reserve Fund deposit, and I'm going to turn it over to Jared to really talk about what this fund is all about.
Yeah, so the Capital Reserve Fund, or what we often call the CRF, is a fund that we use to replace some of our existing assets within our facility. This was established by our voters in 2019. And the money is approved every year by the voters on what goes into this account so that the school board can then do those replacements. We currently look at our CIP. So CIP is our capital improvement plan. This is something that goes before the planning board or planning committee within the town. So it's not only the school system, but it's also the town that has all of these capital replacement needs. And what the planning board does is they look at all of the infrastructure needs that are happening across the entire town, not just a school, and they're trying to sequence those items so that there isn't a spike in the costs that would be associated to the taxpayers. Currently, we have 71 school projects that fit within the capital improvement plan matrix. Those 71 projects equate for roughly $6 million of projects within our schools over the 6-year period. Currently, for the next fiscal year, we have approximately $700,000 worth of projects that are eligible for the CRF within the capital improvement plan.
It's basically, right, like you can use the CRF to offset some of these costs that we have. And I think, Jared, what I've seen is also the ability for us to use that CRF as a matching grant opportunity. I think it was 2 years ago, we did like $100,000 of lighting upgrades in our gymnasiums and our cafeterias, and it was a $16,000 cost. It was because we had those funds available in the CRF, and so I think that the $250,000 that is being asked this year, we recognize that it's not going to meet all of the needs, but it allows the district to try to do the ones that are the most glaring.
And oftentimes we have to prioritize within the school board on the projects that need to be done. And even though that there are $700,000 worth of project, we know that some of these are going to get pushed back, or some things might even come up because there is another grant that is being offered that we need to match. So this is really a tool that the school board is able to use to ensure that our infrastructure and our assets are going to be not top notch, but where they need to be to support our staff and our students.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you mentioned that because it is a planning tool primarily. And as you said, I mean, we could get a grant and then that might, although we had budgeted something or planned it for say 2 years out, but if that grant opportunity happens now, you move things around. So it has to be, kind of flexible. Jared, I know that, people ask, well, what are you planning on doing? What is the board, what's in their plan for the next couple of years?
Yeah, so there's a number of items that we have within our plan for the next couple of years. What you're seeing or what you'll see in the CIP if you're able to look at it is there's roofing sections that we have to replace in Bartlett. We know that they're at end of life and we know that they're not failing yet, but they're close to failing. And that's a project that's going to cost us roughly $190,000 that we've estimated. If we look at the middle school, we're looking at potentially updating our locker room floors there that are getting scuffed up and used and haven't been really replaced since the school was built. That's $38,000. The cafe tables at the middle school.
That's a big problem.
That is a big problem. But another big one at the middle school is our fire panel. We just had our fire panel replaced here at the high school. And Scott, what was the cost to replace that fire panel?
That panel was almost $50,000. Yeah, so those are not cheap, and you don't always know when they're going to go. So this year, that was a problem for us. Was that luckily we had money in this fund because it went mid-year, and we have to have it to keep the building open. So that's where that CRF becomes an incredibly important tool for the school district because you can use it for matching grants, you can use it for emergencies, you can do it for planned things like we've been doing. But again, it's just a very powerful tool.
Yep. Some other things that we have at the middle school, the last major expenditure that we can see coming up on our CIP is that in-building transformer, making sure that we can actually have power going to the kitchen, making sure that that is a end-of-life asset that we have that we know needs replacement. And that's looking at about $100,000 to replace. We're looking at replacing the district tractor for $800,000. And Scott, the tractor is $80,000.
So that'll be a very expensive.
Yes.
Yeah.
But the tractor itself, it's what does the tractor do?
The tractor does a lot. So obviously, its primary role is snow removal. But the tractor also does a lot of maintenance around our facilities throughout the year. That could be, whether it be spreading mulch or loam. We also will be using the tractor on our new field because you're going to have to do routine maintenance on that. So it's been a very valuable tool for us, but it's primarily the use is for snow removal, for sidewalks. The town does a phenomenal job. They plow all of our schools, but this supplements that as well.
Great. The last item that we have is our heating control. So how do we heat and cool our buildings at Maple and Bartlett and Elementary? And we're looking at a $200,000 expenditure for this replacement. Now, as always, the board is going to look for trying to replace these items through grants so that we don't have to spend our money within our operating budget or within our capital reserve fund. But sometimes grants are not possible, or if it's matching, we'll try to make those available to us. But as we look at this, this is the $700,000 within the CIP. And if we are so blessed to get the $250,000 approved by the voters, we're only looking at $300,000 being in our bank accounts. So we know that there's going to have to be some prioritization on these items and focusing on those items that are really critical to quality within our school system.
I didn't mention this, but there are things that happen throughout the year. So this is a great plan, but when you have, let's say, one of our 2 boilers at Glen Lake went down. So all of a sudden, we need another $35,000, $40,000 to replace that boiler. This allows you, to do that. So thank you, Jared, for that explanation. And now we're going to go to Article number 5, the closing of the Bartlett Elementary School Capital Reserve Fund. And essentially, this fund was created a while back for the purpose of creating an addition to the school, and essentially that project was done. And for the most part, monies that remained, there's about $7,500, maybe a little bit more, remained in that fund for almost 15 years because, again, the vast majority of it was done. And then last summer, we did a windows project. And with that windows project, we found asbestos in the caulking, and we had cost overruns. So the school board decided to use the remaining funds that were in that capital reserve fund to go towards that cost overage, leaving, I don't know, it was under, again, $28.24 was remaining in that fund. So by law, the voters create capital reserve funds and they have to close capital reserve funds. And since now we have a district-wide capital reserve fund, having the Bartlett one just for Bartlett just doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. So in essence, we're asking the voters when you go to the polls on March 14th to close that Bartlett reserve capital reserve fund. There's a very modest balance in it. It'll probably be, I don't know, $30 to $40. Any of those funds will then get deposited into the school's general fund as a revenue, and that fund will close. So this is really, Jared and Kate, this is really more of a housekeeping type issue for the school district. And again, voters created it. Voters need to close it. So that is it for the discussion on the Warrant articles. And again, I want to remind folks that voting will be on March 14th, and it's going to be at the Bartlett Elementary School and at Goffstown High School from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. If you are not registered to vote, you can register a same day. If you wish to, and you see this early enough, you can go to Town Hall and go to the town clerk's office, and you can register to vote there. But we would encourage folks to get out and vote for both the town and school election on March 14th. And in closing, any last words from Kate or Jared?
I would say, Scott, just a reminder, if people do have questions about anything with the school budgets or any of the Warrant articles, definitely go to the SAU19 website. Most of our information's there, or if you have any questions, feel free to actually reach out to your school board member or a member of the administration at the SAU. They are very approachable, and they often will get back to you as soon as they can with the information that's needed.
Well, thank you. And Kate, anything?
Well said. I think we have a lot of resources that are out on the website with the presentations we've done, providing greater detail, more in-depth information if folks are interested or have questions. And as Jared said, we're always available at the SAU for any questions or clarity if folks are seeking that.
All right. I want to thank everyone. And again, please remember to vote on March 14th. Thanks again.